and a warm welcome to the latest edition of Conversations in Drug Development, brought to you by the team at Boyd's. This podcast is for our fellow community of scientists and clinicians working in the wonderful world of cell and gene therapy and drug development. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy the conversation.
Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Katherine Bowen. I'm a Senior Director in Regulatory Affairs at Boyd's, and I am delighted to be joined in the studio today by Dr. Julie Warner, Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at Boyd's. Hello and welcome, Julie.
Hello, Katherine. Long time no see.
Long time no see. It's been a long time. Yeah. So we have a great topic for you today. We are going to be doing our very best to demystify designations. That is our plan. We're going to try very, very hard not to make it Katherine and Julie waffle about regulatory acronyms, but to really bring some of this to life. What are the designations? What do they offer? What products qualify? When to apply? Pros and cons? All of those great things. Really try and bring some of our collective experience to the conversation today. So, where should we start, Julie? I feel I'm old enough to remember a day when there weren't that many of these to talk about. So should we talk a little bit about the history and how we've got to where we are today?
Yeah, it's really interesting, Katherine. I think the field of regulatory affairs itself is quite young. But when we think about the first designation that was introduced, we're going back about 40 years here. And the most common one that people will have heard of is Orphan Drug Designation. And even then, that was only a twinkle in Abby Myers' eye back in 1983 when she was trying to find a treatment for her son's Tourette's syndrome. And ultimately, that grassroots movement led to the Orphan Drug Act in the US, and ultimately as well to the establishment of the National Organization for Rare Disorders in the US. And now, as you mentioned, we have a ton of acronyms that go along with these designations. So let's go through them very briefly. We have ODD, or Orphan Drug Designation, in lots of regions. In the US, we have Fast Track, Breakthrough and Regenerative Medicines Advanced Therapy Designations. I'm going to call those FTD, BTD and RMAT, otherwise we'll be here all day.
But thank you very much for defining it first use.
Yes, good.
Great, thank you.
Ticking the regulatory box there. We have the Priority Medicine Scheme, or PRIME, in Europe. We have the Priority Review Voucher Scheme in the US, which is essentially triggered by designations for rare paediatric diseases or tropical diseases. And then we have other measures globally, such as the Qualified Infectious Disease Product Programme in the States. We have Promising Innovative Medicines Designation in the UK, and we have the more recent Innovative Licensing and Access Pathway and the equivalent for devices as well, so ILAP and IDAP in the UK. And what this means for us really is that it's a very complex situation. We've got different designations based on different criteria with different incentives as well. So it makes it very difficult to determine what the right one is for your programme and why you should go for it and at what time. So it's quite a complex situation. So,
and I don't think that's even an exhaustive list either. And FDA seem to come out with a new designation every month or two. And it's really important to keep your finger on the pulse as we go along. So you said it at the start. I think the one that most people are most familiar with is Orphan Drug Designation. And that's probably the one that we spend the most time talking about in our role in regulatory. And I think people tend to think of Orphan Drug Designation as one bucket, if you like. But of course, we do have some fairly significant similarities and differences across regions. It's not just orphan, right?
Yes. Absolutely. Yeah. So I always think of this as the mother of all designations because it was the first. So as I mentioned, we have the US Orphan Drug Act, which came in 1983. It then took another 17 years for us to have an equivalent regulation in Europe, which is quite a long time. But it's safe to say that it's been incredibly successful in both regions. We've had thousands of designations issued and hundreds of products brought to market for date for orphan diseases. And it's important to remember what we mean by an orphan disease. So it's really a term that was captured to describe those diseases that had traditionally been abandoned by big pharma because they weren't commercially viable enough.
It's not the case anymore. I mean, plenty of big companies have a fair number of orphan designations to their name these days, don't they?
Absolutely. And so we really are talking about those rare diseases. And so this is really when we're thinking about those diseases that affect less than 200,000 patients in the US or less than 5 per 10,000 in Europe, which works out to be about 224,000. So quite similar, but still different criteria. And that's when our first difference comes in. The second difference is in the US, if you want to apply, you only have to show that your product should work in a rare disease. In Europe, we have to show that the product would be likely to work in a serious or life-threatening condition or a chronically debilitating disease. Mm-hmm. But we have another criteria as well, and that's that if there are treatments available And we have to show that the existing treatments aren't satisfactory, or that the product that you're applying for designation for would be of significant benefit over and above those other treatments. And this is really important because all of these criteria are reassessed at the time of your license application in Europe. And if you don't meet the criteria anymore, you can lose your designation, which is quite an important consideration for a lot of companies.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so obviously what this does mean is that we have to apply before we file our license application in EU or US. And what we need to do that is a non-clinical data as a minimum to show that the product should work. In Europe as well, we generally need clinical data, but it does very much depend on the strength of the pharmacological rationale for the use of the product in the indication. And we're basically talking about mechanism of action here. And that's another difference between Europe and the US. And when we think about the pharmacological rationale, that brings in another consideration. So a lot of people will have heard the term salami slicing.
Ah, yes. Bit of salami slicing.
Bit of salami slicing. And that's where a company might try to apply for orphan designation for a non-orphan condition, but they'll take a subset of that non-orphan condition that meets the prevalence criterion. So less than 200,000 in the US, less than 5 per 10,000 in Europe, in order to get the designation and access the incentives. But that is only possible in Europe if it's pharmacologically justified. Now, FDA has always, as we know, taken a slightly broader stance on these things, but they are starting to align.
Yeah, I think we've seen a few examples recently, haven't we, where it does feel like FDA are starting to move closer to Europe on that.
And you can kind of understand it as well, because they've got to control somehow access to those incentives, because they are quite valuable. Would be a bit remiss of us if we didn't mention the other criterion on which you can apply. So if you do have a condition that affects more than 200,000 persons in the US or more than 5 per 10,000 in Europe, you can apply for orphan designation if you feel that the lack of return on the financial investment wouldn't be worthwhile. But this is so rare.
Do you know, I've never done it. I've talked about it previously, but I've never filed one on that basis.
Yeah, and I've tried once and we were unsuccessful.
Oh,
so
well. So there was no reflection on your work, do you?
I hope not, but 1 in 20 years. Yeah, it shows you how rare it is, doesn't it? So, but let's talk a bit about the incentives. So in terms of the incentives, the main benefit in regulators' eyes is market exclusivity. And we hear about this a lot. What that really means is that your product, if it's approved as an orphan drug, is protected against a similar active substance coming along for the same indication and being allowed to reach the market, unless certain derogations apply. But it's important to note this isn't a monopoly against a second product coming through. There is an option for a different reward if you comply with an agreed paediatric investigation plan, but there are lots of strategic considerations around that. And I
feel like a whole podcast could be done on the strategic considerations around that.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that one's looming for me as well. I think there's a lot of detail we could go into, but don't have the time today. So. And of course, market exclusivity is a very late benefit for a lot of companies, and a lot of companies that apply for orphan designation are very early stage. So in terms of those incentives during early development, they're mostly financial. Mm-hmm. So in Europe, you can have fee reductions for scientific advice through the EMA. And in the US, you can get tax credits for your research. But it's very difficult to balance. The timing is absolutely critical, because obviously if you need to have orphan designation before you start a European scientific advice procedure via the EMA in order to get the fee reduction, you need to have enough data to apply. So it's very much a timing issue.
Yeah, and I think we're going to come back to that point repeatedly through the course of the conversation today. It's about finding that Goldilocks moment, isn't it? Of enough data to make your case, but not so much that you've kind of missed the opportunity, if you like. And that does come up an awful lot, in particular when we're talking about orphan designation.
Absolutely.
Okay, so there's so much more we could say about orphans. If anyone would like a podcast on orphan designation, please do let us know. We'd be happy to do one.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about some of the other things, and specifically, why don't we go and talk a little bit about the FDA? Because I think it's fair to say they are probably the agency with the biggest bucket of other designations. So should we talk about the therapy designations, she says, doing the little annoying inverted commas.
I can see you.
Fingers, thank you. Yeah, which is probably the other most common bucket that we get involved in.
It is indeed. And these development stage designations are really interesting. So they offer a number of incentives for developers, depending on which one you go for. But the common theme running through them all as the baseline is that you are eligible for rolling review, which is where you can submit, for instance, your non-clinical data to FDA when it's ready. You can submit your manufacturing data to FDA and then generally follow on with your clinical data being the last piece. And you're also eligible for priority review, which cuts the FDA's review timelines down from the standard 10 months down to 6 months, which is obviously quite interesting.
Hitting it at the moment, I understand.
They are, yes, because we know that you're good on stats. And we're coming back to this. But the other thing they also offer is increased interactions during development with FDA, which is really interesting as well. You do need an open investigational new drug application to be able to request these. And so let's look at them in order of sequence, I suppose, from the lowest hurdle to the highest and then back to the middle one. So Fast Track Designation, or FTD, only requires non-clinical data in a serious condition where there's an unmet need to apply. And so this really is the lowest hurdle. Next up, we've got BTD, breakthrough therapy. I was thinking of this as Fast Track Plus, because essentially, in addition to all of the criteria for Fast Track, you need to have preliminary clinical evidence indicating that your drug might demonstrate a substantial improvement on a clinically significant endpoint over available therapies. So if you imagine that scenario, if there are available therapies available, FDA generally wants to see some kind of early head-to-head data in order to grant BTD. And when you think about it in a rare disease setting or very early development, you might not know what a clinically relevant endpoint is for that disease. So it does make things slightly more difficult. But if you do get it, it formally offers you access to senior staff at FDA and more interactions and a dedicated kickoff meeting. And of course, these designations aren't just a tick box exercise. That kickoff meeting is actually quite meaty.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's worth entering into with a bit of consideration. Then we've got the middle hurdle, RMAT, which is similar to the benefits through BTD, but it's just for regenerative therapies. So we're really talking here about cell and gene therapies and tissue engineered products. And this one for me is really interesting because there's no requirement to show that substantial improvement on a clinically significant endpoint. So FDA here is reflecting that I think these diseases often don't have available treatments or perhaps an understanding of what that endpoint is early in development. So really quite interesting here. So that kind of is like the middle of the road hurdle for me. But I think even with all of this, in reality, what we know is that the agencies will generally engage with a developer if they can see that the product is being developed in an unmet need, regardless of what letters you can put after your name, if you like.
Yeah, I did like what you said about it. It's not just a tick box exercise, and it isn't. It's almost, I think of it more as kind of a commitment between the two, that agencies are going to commit more time to you. But then with that, I do think there comes this responsibility to listen to that advice that comes back. So it can sometimes be a bit of a double-edged sword, these designations. I think we'll probably come back to that a little bit more later on.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, that extra resource and rapidity of review has implications for agencies as well. So I know you've been looking into some of the stats on this, so maybe it'd be a good time to look at that.
I have been looking at some stats. I actually read the PDUFA report, their latest one, which didn't give me any answers around any of this, but was a good read. So there was a review published a couple of years ago that did demonstrate that having one or more of these designations does seem to correlate with a reduction in clinical development and combined clinical development and regulatory review timelines, around 1 to 2 years, which might not sound like much, but actually in drug development terms, that could be a pretty significant time saving. And certainly if you are a person living with a previously untreated disease or one where the therapeutic options aren't great, that can make a massive difference. Now, of course, it's hard to tease out whether it's just because those products were great and they'd have got there quickly anyway, rather than the designation per se. But on the face of it, does seem to speed things through. So well done, FDA. Should we go across the Atlantic? Let's go and speak a little bit about the closest we have to an EU equivalent, which is a bit simpler because we're really talking about PRIME, I guess, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. And PRIME for me is the equivalent of BTD in the US.
I guess that's the closest correlate, isn't it?
It's the closest, isn't it? Yeah. So it's really here we're talking about something that's intended for products that would be eligible for accelerated assessment. So those products that are of major public health interest, particularly from the point of therapeutic innovation. And what it does really, it kind of applies the FDA development and review model to Europe. So often we think of the FDA as a kind of cradle to grave approach. You apply to one division with your IND and it's ultimately that same division that reviews your NDA. We don't have that system in Europe. We're a bit more fragmented with clinical trials being reviewed and approved on a national basis, and then marketing authorisations generally for these rare diseases they will go centrally in Europe. And so it's more of a cradle to grave approach, I think, because the way it's achieved, if you do get access onto the Prime scheme, is through appointment of a rapporteur team, and they're meant to be at your disposal all the way through from that designation or the acceptance onto the scheme right through to licensing. And there is a dedicated kick-off meeting attached to this one again. So we're coming back to it not being a tick box exercise. There are expectations on you once you get onto that scheme. The interesting thing for me, I think, and we've talked about this a lot, is that I don't think there's anything that's really unique to Prime that you can't get without having the actual official Prime scheme designation or access. And it's really there just to help companies or developers navigate their way through the regulatory framework. So it's the role of the regulators is very much to shepherd the product through. And I think that aspect is really helpful for smaller and less experienced companies. And it's worth noting they can apply at a much earlier stage with clinical proof of principle rather than proof of concept. But when you do apply that early, if you are a small to medium organisation, then you will only have EMA administrators assigned to your programme. So you don't get that rapporteur team assignment until you've got enough data to convert to what we call full Prime. And so I think when you look at the other end of the scale, the value of Prime participation for a very clued up company, a larger developer, is perhaps more difficult to discern because they know how to navigate the regulatory framework. And of course, again, we've got slightly awkward timings because we know that EMA advises Prime scheme entry before CHMP advice is sought so that they can maximise the value.
And they'll turn it down if it's too late.
They will. They'll turn it down if it's too late. So, and we know that when we add on the expectations around paediatric investigation plans, we know that EMA discourages parallel review of a scientific advice request and a PIP. And so it's very difficult, I think, to tease out that perfect spot to...
It's that Goldilocks moment
exactly.
Again, isn't it? Having enough data but not gone too far. But then that whole process of actually getting Prime adds time on, probably in the same space where you'd be looking at going for scientific advice. So mapping all of that out early enough is really important if you've got a product that's genuinely looking like it'll be in that space.
Exactly. So I think it really does come down to thinking, does this actually add value for us, or can we access what we need or what's going to be beneficial for us outside of the scheme before you just go for it for the sake of it, almost, so that you can tick a box and have a nice press release. So I think it's really got to add value. And we've both had mixed experience with Prime, haven't we? It's safe to say.
Yeah, we have. And I've had a change of rapporteurship during Prime, which was one of those things. It happened, but that lost some of the benefits of it. And I think you've had experiences of struggling to get the expedited follow-up advice that you'd have hoped for as well. And it's not that surprising. Some of these agencies are really, really busy. So it is, again, it's on both sides. The agencies are trying to commit more time, but that does bring us back to then you probably have to listen when you do get to speak to them in these circumstances.
Yeah. So given that we're both a little bit on the fence, have we got any more stats on this?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up. And the first thing to say, and I think anyone who's done Prime applications will have realised this, getting Prime is a really, really high hurdle. The success rate is about 20 to 30%. It's varied over the years, but it's around that. And with preponderance of oncology products and ATMPs, which you probably expect, honestly. I mean, Prime was originally all about trying to identify those products early that might make it through the accelerated assessment process. And actually, if you look at that as a metric, if you take the 21 products who had Prime designation that have actually got as far as going through the MAA process, a reasonable number, so actually 17 of them have managed to get accelerated assessment, which is, that's pretty good. It's not an easy thing to get. Only 7 of those finished the procedure on accelerated assessment. But again, it's not unusual that procedures revert back. And if you look at the reasons for not getting Prime, it's pretty much what we've said, actually. So either you don't have enough data or you've come along too late to not take advantage. So it's that Goldilocks moment, really. So where should we go now? Should we head back over the Atlantic and talk a little bit about priority review vouchers?
Indeed. Yeah. So, and we're really talking here about the rare paediatric disease designations because that's the one that's hugely taken off for FDA. And the other one, of course, is the tropical disease PRV.
Not been as successful, though, I think, arguably.
No, which is quite understandable, really, because there are a lot more companies developing products for rare paediatric diseases than tropical diseases, which is quite a niche market, to be fair. So the PRV schemes are intended to incentivise drug development by awarding a PRV to developers who gain approval of a license application for specific therapeutic area, so a rare pediatric disease or a tropical disease. And the incentive here is that the priority review voucher that's awarded after approval of an NDA or a BLA for a rare pediatric disease can be used for a subsequent NDA or BLA review. And when you include that priority review voucher, when you file that subsequent NDA or BLA, FDA has to apply a priority review timeline. So instead of the standard 10 months, the review timeline comes down to 6 months. And of course, it's a lot of commercial interest in that, because it saves you 4 months to market and 4 months to patient access, which is great for patients as well. But because that 4 months is of such commercial value, these vouchers often sell for millions of dollars, which is why a lot of people are always interested in them. And investors are always interested in them too, if you qualify. So we're talking here about rare pediatric diseases, and the definition of a rare pediatric disease is one where more than 50% of the patients with the condition are aged under the age of 18 years. And it's really interesting here. So it's even within that group, there's some diseases might qualify and some might not. So if you have rare disease that starts at the age of 5 years, say, and the severity is very much within the patient population aged under 18, you would probably qualify for rare pediatric disease designation. If, on the other hand, you have a disease that has an onset in teenage years, but the severity of the disease is such that it impacts in the 20s and 30s, then that wouldn't qualify for rare pediatric disease designation, because the bulk of the severity and the incidence is outside of the pediatric population. So it's really interesting to note here that the designation only indicates the product could qualify for the priority review voucher scheme. It doesn't mean that you have got it or you will get it. It's just an early recognition that you could qualify. Now, the interesting thing as well about this legislation is that it's due to expire at the end of September this year.
Now, are they going to renew?
Do you know, I think they will. My gut feeling is that they will. So historically, it's been renewed about, I can't remember how many times, multiple times anyway. And sometimes it's actually been renewed retrospectively as well. So it's kind of properly expired, and then Congress has then renewed it. And of course, we've got NORD urging Congress to renew, which is great news for patients. Perhaps not so good news if you're an FDA reviewer and you're having to jump through a 6-month review timeline compared to 10 months when there's less medical need, perhaps. But yeah, it's just really interesting. And we know a bit about how FDA is currently doing on the priority review timeline. So it's a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Now, I think that's probably covered off most of the main designations, but I mean, that's certainly not an exhaustive list. Recently, the FDA have launched the Advanced Manufacturing Technologies Designation Programme. There's discussion around platform designations coming out of the omnibus reform discussions. So there is a constant stream of these kind of designations coming through. So it's so important to keep your finger on the pulse, if you like, just to make sure that there isn't something that wouldn't really help the development of your product. I think it would be remiss if we had this conversation and didn't at least mention the UK. I feel like they're a kind of a phoenix arising from the flames of COVID and Brexit under the wonderful leadership of June Rain. So what have they got in the UK, Julie, that's worth us mentioning today?
Yeah, I think I completely agree with you. MHRA is totally carving out its position as a driver of innovation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we mentioned earlier PIM designation. That in itself doesn't provide any benefits, but it's the first step in the early access to medicine scheme in the UK, in which UK patients can receive an unlicensed product prior to full approval under certain circumstances. And then we've got the recent ILAP and IDAP schemes, and these are great for me. These go beyond pure regulatory approval, and they're truly looking at speeding up patient access. So it's looking at all of that other stuff outside of the regulatory approval, like pricing and reimbursement. How do we actually physically deliver some of this really novel technology inside the NHS and actually get it to patients rather than just sat on a shelf or inside a machine somewhere? So it's really an integrated approach, and I think MHRA should be applauded for bringing this in. I think it's great. It's truly novel, and I'm really excited to see what comes from this. But again, timing is crucial.
Timing is often crucial. And for all of these, I think that has been the theme that's run through, isn't it? And that has to be planned for, to make sure that you're getting the best out of these designations. And I think it's critical to understand that timing piece, but also really critical to understand what you want to get from any of these designations, and understand that if you ask a regulator for additional interactions with them, that there's probably then an onus on the developer to take that and to do something with it. And I didn't mention we were talking about the prime metrics, but there is one product that got prime that got turned down for accelerated assessment and actually ultimately got refused. their MA. And the reason given is that they didn't follow the advice that they received through that process. So let that be a warning to us all. But there is some evidence that having the right designation for the right product at the right time really can speed up the whole process. But we are going to have to keep our finger on the pulse, I think, Julie, aren't we?
We are indeed.
Anything else? Anything else you would say to sum up today?
No, I think I totally endorse that these aren't a tick box exercise, but with the right planning and the right resourcing, then there is a lot that can be gained from them. And obviously what we haven't mentioned is that you can access multiple of these. It's not just one.
That's true. They're not mutually exclusive.
They're not. So if you have the right strategy and you can plan plenty of time in advance, then I think there's a lot of gains to be had.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time. This has been wonderful as always, Julie. And thank you very much to everyone for listening. Bye-bye.
Likewise.
Thank you for listening to Conversations in Drug Development, the podcast series brought to you by the team at Boyd's. Don't forget to follow us on the usual podcast platforms or visit our website to ensure you don't miss out on any of our future episodes.